Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this week's video, I would like to present another layout design. This design is for an HO scale layout in a reasonable space. It's about 14 feet by 19 overall, although as you can see from this diagram, it's a rather awkward shape. It's certainly not a 14 by 19 rectangle. This grey wall to the north is a 45-inch tall dwarf wall around the stairs being just off the frame to the top of the picture. It's an attic room, and the north and south walls are knee walls only about 48 inches high. These two parallel lines that I've drawn just inside each one demarcate the 4 and 8 inch elevation lines. So the outer one is 52 inches from the floor and the inner one is 56 inches from the floor. And I wanted to put those in first so that I have an indication of where I'm going to be relative to the ceiling, so I don't run into clearance problems later. The area to the right of this red line is the no-go zone. This area to the east has to be left open for family use. The client wanted to model a short section of main line for rail fanning. He wanted a small yard, some engine facilities, some industries to switch, and some interesting, mostly urban scenery through which the line runs. And it is for the transition and early diesel period. Mostly diesels, just a few late steam locomotives. And he was going to go with small to medium locomotives and cars no longer than 60 feet long, so as to be able to use fairly sharp curves. Because he already knew in advance that he wasn't going to be able to get really broad curves, which would be necessary for large locomotives and full-length cars to look good. The client also sent me some links to an N-scale layout that had appeared in Model Railroader and that he really liked, just to give a feel of the sort of scenes he was looking for, even though that layout that influenced him would not have been able to be scaled up to HO and still fit into his space. So with that introduction out of the way, let's move on and start figuring out how best to use the space. I tried a few different footprints, but this is the only one that had any promise. It's basically a folded dog bone with staging at the back and the visible run at the front. I did ask him if it was okay to grab an extra couple of feet in this north lobe if it made a difference, although he was not keen on that idea. So I restricted the plan to the original boundary lines. And one of the things on his nice to have but not essential list was a waterfront scene. And I felt the best way of getting that in was with a short branch to a harbour. Initially, I was hoping to be able to get the mainline curve behind the harbour branch, but the width just wasn't sufficient. So I had to come up with an elevation change sufficient to get the mainline to loop over the harbour. Older viewers will probably remember the evocative scene on John Allen's Gory and Defeated Railroad, where the mainline curved on a trestle high above his harbour scene. Although in this case, it's a lot closer to the dock level. We're only going to be able to get about 4.5, 5 inches of clearance instead of the 8 inches that John Allen had. At this point, we weren't sure how many staging tracks I was going to be able to fit. I figured I would aim for 6 or 7, realizing that more is always better. And we were hoping to be able to get a small but workable yard along this north lobe. Now these end curves are drawn at 30-inch radius. And as you can see, the plan is a little bit tight with 30-inch radius curves. And we had already at this point abandoned the double track main line that he was hoping for, because that would take up even more space in the end curves. And that was space that we just didn't have available. Here is the next version with most of the track filled in, just to work out what will fit. I'd already talked to him about reducing the mainline radius by a few inches. Originally we talked about 27 inches, although I ended up with 28 because the extra inch fitted quite well. And we ended up with 8 staging tracks in the 11 to 21 foot range, so plenty long enough, and also the perfect number to be able to have 2 through trains and 2 local trains in each direction. And as you mentioned earlier, most of the layout is going to be urban in nature. The whole of the north lobe and the harbour area with maybe 30% green belt in the middle. And actually the green belt ended up getting reduced significantly. The client really enjoys city modelling. For this next plan, we talked about the possibility of including a car float in the harbour area. This was something that was short-lived because the client decided that although a car float is nice, he'd rather have the extra area available for structures. And although I've drawn a lot of spurs heading towards the doors to the south, you can notice that two of them were the same spur in alternative locations, either one or the other, but not both. And I suggested some dummy tracks heading off the layout to give the impression that the harbour facilities extend beyond what is modelled. Probably should have mentioned earlier, I was able to put in this extra passing siding, which means that most of the visible main line is double tracked, just the end curves are single. That would allow him to stage some non-stop meets if he wants to for photographic purposes, allowing him some of the advantages of the double track main line that he originally would have liked. Also, at this point, we started talking about what some of the industries might be, and he liked the idea of several small industries at one end of the yard, contrasting with a single large industry at the other end. And he found an aerial photograph of a tyre plant that he really liked. So we decided that we were going to have a cut down version of that. Although the original industry, if modelled full size, would probably take up more space than the entire north lobe of the layout. It was a fairly long and narrow site with pairs of industrial tracks heading between long rows of buildings. So I've tried to use that same arrangement here, although it's truncated to a fraction of its prototype length. And I showed one spur heading off through the backdrop, implying that it goes deeper into the plant. Something he really liked about this plan is the diagonal road system in the harbour area, with all the grade crossings cutting through the intersection at an angle. He felt that that really evoked the type of urban railroading that he had in mind. This plan went through several different iterations with just minor changes. Here's another one of them. I've started to fill in a lot more of the industries in the harbour area, and this wide open space in the middle is earmarked for I've labelled it a cement plant, although when I took another look at the photograph on Google Maps, I realised it was actually a gravel plant. And it was in a dense urban area along the side of a main road. And also in this area, there was industrial spurs down both sides of the street. So that's the scene that this area is based upon. And these two long parallel spurs dive between a pair of tall structures, given the appearance that they may go on further. And the grey industry in front of the access opening is based on a shallow relief industry that he recently built, and asked if I could find a spot for it. It would need to be expanded because what he's built right now is just the middle section. But the way I envisage this industry is that this was the main plant, and more recently they purchased another building across the street to use for additional warehouse space. And there are two loading docks. More than likely one is for shipping and one is receiving, and both of them can load boxcars on two tracks with bridge plates between them. I put a bank of chemical storage tanks at this end of the industry, so there'll be a tank car spot right on this switch. So this industry has 5 car spots. The client asked for a structure on wood piles over the harbour, so I've drawn that in this area where we have a nice wide area. We both felt that the parallel sided stone pier was better than the tapered one that the car float necessitated. And I also included a timber jetty at an angle heading off the front of the benchwork, thus allowing a wider variety of building materials. Another thing that he really liked on this plan was the road on the northern lobe, which would drop down sharply from well above track level at the back, crossing the tyre plant lead tracks at grade, and then continuing to slope down to an underpass under the main line, thus forcing some interesting elevation changes in this lobe, which otherwise could end up looking too flat. Another improvement in this design was the addition of 1 extra yard track. We now have 3 yard tracks off the passing siding instead of just 2, which greatly improves the switching opportunities. In this view, I have worked on a possible corner treatment over the staging yard. Bear in mind that this is just the plan view of what we're representing. It wouldn't all need to be built. These structures in the front would basically just be a front wall and a roof. The structures behind would just be taller structures with front walls only, and the road wouldn't actually need to be modelled. It would just be implied in the gap between the buildings, because it would be impossible to see down in there without standing up on tiptoe and leaning right over the structures, which of course would allow you to see the trains in the staging yard, while making them completely hidden from normal viewing angles. In this view, I have indicated a solution to one of the potential problems created by the dwarf wall around the stairs. Now obviously it will not be possible to reach under the benchwork in this area, so clearly we don't want to have undermount switch machines in this area. So I've shown how these 4 critical turnouts can be operated by surface mount switch machines hidden in the industrial buildings. The activating rod will just be run in a piece of brass tubing hidden in the ballast. The only complexity with that is that that has to be installed before one lays the spurs that run over the back of it. Now at this time, the client wasn't sure whether he liked the arrangement in this corner, so he asked me to show what it could look like with just shallow relief structures in front of it, with the staging yard entirely open air. And this is what I came up with, putting a row of smaller structures. I don't think I mentioned earlier, the idea of this area is to have a drainage canal coming out of culverts under the structures. It's an interesting way of getting some water under the track without running into the problem of waterfalls to get over the staging yard. And of course the staging yard tracks are going to be at about the same level as the visible trackage. But I digress. Anyway, back to the main theme. Eventually he decided he didn't like this arrangement, and we ended up going back to a compromise between the 2 systems. Another thing I showed in this detailed plan was this one industry which we are deciding to develop as a plastic pellets manufacturing plant. Notice I added an extra spur. So we've got 2 spots for boxcars on the back spur, covered hoppers and tank cars on the front spur. We're imagining that it is a repurposed structure and that the spur used to head inside the building, but that portion of it is no longer used, so these doors remain permanently closed. Of course, there's no room to extend the spur inside because the staging yard track heads very close to this corner behind the wall. So I envisaged a tall brick-built wing, the dark grey area, a much lower 1 or 2 story building in the light grey, and a series of additions, probably with metal siding, just to give a contrast in building materials. And he wrote back and said I absolutely nailed it with that industry. He loved everything about it. This version shows the combination of the shallow relief structures in front of the staging yard and another row apparently behind the road over the rear of the tracks, where it's not really going to impede viewing from any normal angle. We also decided to add 1 more rail-served industry in this narrow strip between the passing siding and the staging yard. And this industry, there really is room for the spur to extend into the building with a working roll-up door. It can just go straight for 2 car lengths, or it can even curve around through these structures all the way to here where the mouse is now, to hold about 5 cars inside the building if the client is that way inclined. And now here is the final version of the plan. In most cases the track has remained the same. I did do a little bit of adjustment in this area. This formerly left-hand number 6 turnout was replaced by a number 4Y, which improves the angle of this diagonal spur, allowing plenty of room for a bridge pier. I moved this curve closer to the main line so that this truss span can be a little bit shorter, and it contrasts with the deck girder spans all the way around the rest of the curve. I've also shown the gravel industry. Let me see if I can find a photograph of that quickly. Okay, here is a photograph of the industry. It's in Seattle, Washington. As you can see, I have represented the industry in its entirety, although the gravel bins at the rear have been rearranged to fit the shape of the site. And the various elevations of that industry give a unique opportunity, with the large single-story building extending under the high-level track while the gravel bins tower above it. So the mainline trains pass right through the scene. And I think that'd look really interesting. Now, although we have mostly urban scenery, I have shown several areas of greenbelt. One thing to note is the tire plant that the client is representing was surrounded by dense shrubbery on all sides. Another area of greenbelt extends all the way back over the staging yard in this corner, allowing for a deep scene where you really don't need to be able to see the trains in staging at this point, because you can see both ends of them. So it's okay if the middle is covered, as long as there's a chunk of scenery that can be removed for emergency access or maintenance to the tracks below. And as I was just sending off this final version, I had an idea for an improvement in this area. There's no reason why the benchwork can't be bumped out just a little bit here. It doesn't protrude into the aisle at all, and it allows this spur to either be straightened slightly or sharpened slightly, allowing much bigger space in this area for an industry. Because we had talked about an industry in this area that is either abandoned completely or is still active but no longer rail served, and then the lead track to it just being used as a team track. And also the idea was to put the foundation for a demolished depot at this point where the mouse is now. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about this layout. The client is really happy about the design. He is anxious to get building it. I will probably be receiving updates from him from time to time, and if so, maybe I'll be able to present them to you. So that's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope to see you again next time. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.